You got a goal? Well, I gotta go. So let's grab a blanket, turn off your lights for true scary stories that happened during soccer. Secret hiding spot. When I was young, I believe about 8 years old, my family was attending my little brother's soccer game. Me being a bored ADHD youth, I ran off to play in a nearby park within view of where the parents were standing. The view of some of the park was slightly obscured by a few trees, which is an important tidbit for later. I wasn't the only kid at the park, and with some organization from one big kid, we all became involved in an exciting game of tag soccer. As the game dissipated, the big kid approached me. If my memory is correct, he was around 14 years old. He introduced a game of hide and seek with me, and after it asked if I wanted to see his secret hiding spot. Now, I've been very educated by my parents on how to avoid sketchy situations and avoid abductions, and this otherwise would have set off red flags for me, except for the fact that he was a teenager, so in my little head he was just another kid, I guess. He praised it as a secret spot where we could spy on people but nobody could see us, and claimed that he stashed candy away that he wanted to share with me. Once we pressed further into the woods, I was grabbed from behind a tree by an older man whose face was obscured from me. Within a moment of him beginning to drag me, I was pushed to the ground when the sounds of loud yelling began to draw closer to us. The cops arrived within a minute of my parents alerting me missing and ended up capturing the 14-year-old boy who was covered in needle marks and finding a nearby shaded van filled with illicit drugs. I believe they found that man shortly after. From earlier, when I started playing hide and go seek on the outskirts of trees surrounding the park, my parents had noticed ahead of time that I wasn't visible from the park anymore. After a few minutes of calling my name, they decided to call the police, who arrived just in time, and I hate to imagine what could have happened if my mom hadn't been so attentive. Textbook child abduction guy, let's not meet again. Hey, can you buy us some soccer balls? I almost forgot that this happened until I started reading Let's Not Meet. When I was 8 years old, my dad took my brother and I to the park to play. At this park, it was connected to a school, so it had a fairly large park and in a broad view of where our car was, so my dad agreed to let me walk it by myself. As I start my walk, I notice a group of older boys. They were in their mid-teens, so anywhere from 13 to 16, sitting under a tree, watching everyone else walk by. I had a weird feeling, so I decided to avoid them. There was two routes you can take. One would lead closer to the stands where they were, and another would lead closer to the actual park. A few minutes go by as I walking thinking about what I was going to do that day and realized that I had on accident took the wrong path and ended up coming up on the boys. So as I began walking really fast past them, one of them called out, "Hey sweetie, come talk to us." To which I think I said something like, "My dad won't let me talk to boys." And of course they laughed like it was the funniest thing in the world, which didn't creep me out but made me really angry that these smelly boys were making fun of my dad. So I just kind of said something like, "You're mean and you stink," and started to walk away, ignoring their whistlings and calls to come back and play with them, when one of them called out, "Can you buy us a soccer ball?" And when I turned back to say no, I realized they had all started walking towards me. Now, really terrified of older boys, I turned and started running, panicking when I felt them start throwing rocks and gaining closer. So in my 8-year-old frightened old mind, I did the only thing I knew would work for sure. I told them that I was going to tell my dad on them. And finally they left me alone after a few ugly name calls directed at me. I found my dad and told him what happened, but they were gone by then. And my dad decided to end our day at the park early. I remember being more upset about that than the boys following me. Odd neighbor. This odd neighbor didn't like us playing ball nearby and does something about it. This goes back to the mid-90s, I would say 1995 plus or minus 2 years. My grandma, already a widow, lived alone in her house in a small village surrounded by hills and small mountains. As it happens, my grandma's house was in the slope of a mountain, besides a small partially paved road, hardly wide enough for one car. This road was de facto used for my parents and uncles to drive their cars up to the house when visiting, and they would park in the road itself as there was no traffic whatsoever. So me, my sister, and our 3 cousins, all of us in the range of 8 to 13 years old, took advantage of the paved parts of the road to play soccer over there, as we would spend almost 2 months every summer at my grandma's, whose vacations were the highlight of the year. Well, across the road from my grandma's, there was another house whose occupant, an older man who lived alone was a bit eccentric. His name was Pepe. Pepe would only leave the house to go shopping and to take care of his garden, was a bit of a loner, and my grandma, who amongst us was the only one who ever had a conversation with, had a polite but distant approach towards him. After all this 30 years living in front of each other, separated by no more than 10 meters, hey, privacy is always to be respected. Pepe led quite a monk life that was threatened only by the naughty football kids. In the beginning, he just stared at us from one of the windows as we would play. As the kids we were, this was actually quite comical, and we looked at each other and rolled our eyes and said, "Oh, it's this weirdo looking us again." From the window, he would stay there for as long as we played ball, more than hours sometimes, with his poker face on, never said a word to us. I do recall we would wave at him so he would feel uncomfortable for displaying such a weird behavior, but he never waved back and never left until we stopped playing ball. He was clearly pissed off, and our assumption, of course, was that the ball was the problem. This situation repeated itself almost 2 or 3 times a week, and my grandma grew uncomfortable with us playing the ball, so she repeatedly told us not to play, especially over there. Mistake. One evening, we were doing our thing, and Pepe had been staring at us for 20 minutes or so from his window, when suddenly he disappeared. Now that was new. Not a minute passes, and Pepe shows up in his big-ass porch, oriented towards my grandma, where he had some firewood and a bunch of long sticks. He had a small knife in his hand, but we didn't notice it. The situation is still funny for us because he's there looking super upset, staring at us, dressed with his usual apron and wooded shoes. So we once more look at each other, rolled our eyes up, and continued our laughters. Football game carries on. Pepe grabs one of the long stick and starts to sharpen it, as if to make a spear. By this point, I remember our faces started to change, but I guess our feeling was that he was just trying to intimidate us, and bottom line, we were not doing anything illegal by playing soccer in public property, and we the kids had discussed amongst us several times that he was being weird on purpose to scare us to stop playing. And then it happened. He left the porch with his super wooden shoes and started to chase us with the spear, pointing upwards as he was a frickin' medieval knight in a tournament, but without a horse. Crew and me ran for our lives to my grandmother's and locked the door completely in shock as my grandma came inside from the backyard after hearing our screams. As we told her what happened, Pepe was still outside the house screaming that he would set it on fire with all of us inside. My grandma called 112, and in the meantime, my father, who had gone for a jog, arrives at the house and finds the neighbor screaming like a possessed man with a spear in his hand and engages him. Now we are in the top floor of my grandma's, watching my father and Pepe screaming at each other, and eventually Pepe drops the spear. Police arrive and file a report, then goes and talks to Pepe for a while. As one of the policemen told us later, Pepe wanted to sue us for playing ball in the street by his house and thus threatening his property with damage. It seemed that police warned Pepe he wouldn't sleep at his place again if they ever had to come back again. But after he threatened to burn my grandma's house with all of us inside, no one slept that night anyways. We never played ball again around there, and a couple years later, Pepe left the house to live with a relative across the country, as my grandma would find out later. So, you know the drill. Beware your odd neighbors and Pepe. Let's not meet again. To the man by the shed. My boyfriend, 23-year-old male, and I, 23-year-old female, recently decided that we wanted to take the new tent we bought on its first trip. The tent was one that hooks up to your car to provide more storage space, and we were excited to try it out. We had planned a kayaking trip the next day at a kayak rental shop. It was supposed to be a nice, inexpensive, outdoorsy weekend getaway. We tend to book things last minute, so all the state parks and professional campgrounds were full. This led us to a website that is essentially an Airbnb for campsites. The place we chose was a 100-acre property, just 20 minutes south of the kayak shop. Of all the sites in the area, it was described as having working bathrooms, showers, it allowed for campfires, and all the sites were car accessible. The site was almost the most reviewed in the area, with 3 5 out of 5-star reviews. The area was very rural, so we didn't think much of it about the low number of reviews for any of the campsites. The renter was Mary, who only ever texted us updates, but seemed sweet. We start out 2 hours a bit later than anticipated, which put us behind the 11 a.m. time we had originally informed the host, but we tried to keep her updated with the new schedule. She just told us to let her know when we arrive at the address she sent us. We arrived at the address and were greeted with the barn from the pictures. It had string lights all over it, seemingly fairly new, and just gave a nice feel to it. We sat in the car for a minute and struggled with self-service to text the host to let her know we had arrived. 10 minutes after our text sends, a sweaty man who appears to be in his 60s pulls up in an HCV. He lets us know that he's the father-in-law to Mary, and she is busy taking care of the seasoned harvest and sent him instead. He lets us know that we can take the car anywhere on the property and offers to show us around in the HCV. My boyfriend, visibly uncomfortable at the time, declines the offer and asks a few more questions about the woods and how far into them we are allowed to take the car. Anywhere. There's no designated campsites. We can go anywhere we want to. And the ATV man even offers to help pull my car out if it gets stuck. We ask one final question about self-service, and he jokes that if we are from around here, we'll understand that reception works better on one side of the barn than the other. I am from around here and thought it was funny, but once he said that, I realized he didn't have any ounce of an accent for here like he should. Eventually, he leaves, and we begin exploring the property on foot. The bar is nice and maintained. It was fully lit in the middle of the day, with the string lights decorating the interior, too. It is insulated and has a working kitchen. The only warning we got was to not drink the water. It seemed like a place that would host small 50-guest weddings. We walked past the shed, out behind the barn to get to the trails that ran through the woods. After going through a hike that my car would have never survived, we decided it was best to just camp by a small creek, and we chose a spot on the side opposite of the barn. We were still within walking distance, but we used my car as a buffer to feel a bit more isolated. We choose our spot and then go into the main town to eat and walk around. We messaged Mary about the fire policy, and she told us that they will never deliver a fire ring to the barn for us to take to camp. We arrive back at the barn about an hour and a half from nighttime. We drive by the barn and the lights have been turned off. We assumed it was on a timer thing as to not waste energy or money. We also noticed the fire ring had not yet been delivered. We start the grueling 30-minute setup in the sticky heat and reward ourselves with a sit in the air-conditioned car. We notice it looked like it's about to rain. So my boyfriend and I pulled up a card game and wait for it to pass inside the car. It only lasted about 10 minutes, but it started to be sunset. The tent held up nicely. We felt okay leaving it for a second. Needing to use the bathroom, we start walking to the barn. As we cross the creek, we hear what sounds like someone in the shed moving things around. A bit unsettling, to be honest, but I tell my boyfriend that maybe they use equipment today and it's just sitting in there making the cracking cool-off noise that it sometimes does. We get to the barn and the lights are still off, but the fire ring is there. We go in and check to make sure the power is off, and it's not just the lights outside. None of the light switches will work, so we assume the power is cut. Anyways, maybe it's just a timer thing. No worries, right? We step out of the barn and get 10 feet away, and we hear a hum in the distance to the opposite side of the shed. The power to the barn is restored. We change direction to use the bathroom. As soon as we stepped inside, the power cuts. I start to get a weird feeling, and I can tell he has it too. I look to my boyfriend and say, maybe they're just watching us. I immediately follow it up with, no, that's a lot worse. We walk back outside, and the lights turn on. My boyfriend says that we need to leave, and I have the same gut-wrenching primal fear. We put the ring back by the barn since we had moved it 10 feet, and the barn lights start flickering. We briskly walk to the car. Being from Alapachia, I know better than to run. The 30-minute setup was torn down and packed up in 5 minutes or so, and we jump into the car and lock it. I managed to get my car going, thanking God that the rain did not get my car stuck. We start towards the driveway, and just as we made it to the road, my boyfriend looks back and sees a man standing by the shed, watching us. As soon as my car pulls out onto the road, we get a text from Mary letting us know that the fire ring is out by the barn. She also informs us that we are welcome to stay in the barn if the rain had messed up our camping experience. We arrive at a nice hotel, willing to splurge for safety. At this point, it's 10 p.m. at the earliest. A sweet older lady checks us in, desperate for validation and just comfort from anyone. We tell her what had just happened to us at the campsite. She looks shocked. She asked if we had seen the news lately, which we respond that we had not. The lady tells us that Couples in the state have been going missing. All of them had gone camping. 3 couples were truly missing, and one was recently found on the side of the freeway slashed to near death. There are, to the time of posting, still recovering in the hospital. We couldn't find many articles about where in the site, but the look on the lady's face suggested it was near us. We get to our room and text Mary back to tell her we're not staying. Thank you for staying with us. We lock the door and I break down into tears. I will not forget that feeling I got at the barn. The primal fight or flight feeling. And the feeling of being watched. I feel it in my throat just writing this. I never want to experience that again. So, to the man by the shed who watched us drive away, let's never meet